Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we are going to start discussing the diseases and various pathological conditions that affect various parts of the kidney. But before we proceed to discuss the diseases and various pathological conditions, we will make a brief discussion of the structure and function of the various parts of the kidney, because an understanding of the normal anatomy and physiology of the kidney is very important before we proceed to discuss various pathological conditions. We know that each person has two kidneys, one on each side, and the kidneys are located in the retroperitoneal position. By that we mean that they lie behind the peritoneal membrane. The left kidney in each person is pushed a little down by the lever that lies at the above the upper pole of the left kidney. Anatomically, the kidneys are situated in relation to the vertebral column between the thoracic 12 and lumbar 3 vertebrae. The kidneys are partially protected by the floating ribs, which are the rib 11 and rib 12. The major function of the kidney is the filtration of the blood. The kidneys in our body work just like a filtration plant, and normally the kidneys filter about 150 liters of the blood in one day. If we suppose that a person is having 5 liters of blood, then we can say that the whole blood in a person is filtered 30 times in less than 1 hour continuity. The kidneys are protected by the three layers. The outermost is the renal fascia, which is a layer of dense connective tissue. Then the middle layer is the adipose tissue layer made of fats, which protects the kidney from trauma, and the inner layer is the renal capsule, which gives the kidney a shape. The medial portion of each kidney, there is an indentation known as the hilum, and this is the portion where renal arteries, lymphatics and nerves enter the kidney, while the ureter uh, and nerves also, ureters leave the kidney at the hilum, and the nerve supply also enters into the kidney through the hilum. So the hilum of the kidney is the entry and exit point for ureters, renal arteries, renal veins, lymphatics and nerves. If we take a cross section of the kidney, we can see that the kidney is divided into an outer portion known as the cortex and an inner portion known as the medulla. The renal cortex is further divided into an outer cortical zone and an inner zone known as the inner juxtamedullary zone. The renal medulla consists of 10 to 18 renal cone-shaped pyramids, and towards the pelvis of the kidney, the pyramids at their apex contains the renal papilla or nipples. In between the renal pyramids are the extensions of the cortical zone known as the renal columns, and the each pyramid with its uh, outer cortical region uh, make the renal lobes. The filtered urine passes from the collecting ducts to the minor calyces, then into the major calyces, and then into the renal pelvis, and then flows through the ureters into the urinary bladder, where it is stored, and at proper time the maturation reflex can be stimulated to pass urine. Now, the functional unit of the kidney is the nephron, and the nephron consists of the glomerulus, which are the capillary tufts where blood filtration starts, and it also contains the tubules. For example, the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubules and collecting ducts. So the blood filtered in the glomerulus passes through the proximal convoluted tubule, then it passes through the loop of Henle into the distal convoluted tubules, and finally into the collecting ducts. From here, at the apex of each pyramid, the collecting ducts get together to form the papillary duct, which drain into the minor calyces, then into the major calyces, renal pelvis, and then finally the urine is carried by the ureters into the urinary bladder. So the upper end of the proximal tubules is the Bowman capsule, which encloses the glomerular tuft of the capillaries. Blood enters into the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole and leaves the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole. Normally, when we study the blood supply of the body, we see that the arterioles that carry oxygenated blood to the capillaries, when it leaves the capillary tufts, the blood enters into the venules. But here in this situation, we can see that this is not the venule, but the blood that leaves the glomerular capillaries enters into a second part of the arterioles known as the efferent arterioles, and this efferent arterioles again divides into branches to form the peritubular capillaries, and the peritubular capillaries then finally unite to form the venules and to drain into the venous system. Now, the formation of urine by the nephron is an essential function of the kidney. As we know that the blood enters into the glomerulus through the afferent arterioles, which break down into a network of capillaries, and these capillaries are the filtration units. Then the blood enters, as it leaves the glomerulus, into the efferent arteriole, and as I said, the efferent arteriole again divides into peritubular capillary network that surround the tubules, and here the fine tuning of the filtrate occurs. So the functions of the nephron is, number one is the filtration. The blood in the glomerular capillary tufts, this blood is under high pressure, because as compared to the efferent arteriole, the afferent arteriole is wider and the efferent arteriole is narrow. So when the blood is pushed from a wider afferent arteriole into a narrow efferent arteriole, the it gave rise to high pressure in the glomerulus, and under this high hydrostatic pressure, the blood, with the exception of the plasma proteins and cells, the plasma, a major portion of the plasma is filtered into the glomerulus. Now, when this filtrate passes through the tubules, many more things are then reabsorbed. And from these tubules, certain substances are secreted into and this is, we can say that, the final and fine tuning of the filtrate occurs in the tubules. And about 99% of the filtered substances, they are reabsorbed by the tubules and handed over to the blood. So coming to the functions of the kidney and nephron, this is there occurs filtration at the glomerular level, there occurs reabsorption at the tubular level, and some substances are also secreted into the filtrate from the tubular walls, and finally the filtrate becomes urine and excreted through the ureters into the urinary bladder. So these functions of the kidney, we summarize them as the kidney is involved in the regulation of body fluid volumes and blood pressure. The kidneys maintain and regulate the osmolality and osmolarity of the blood. The kidney is involved in maintaining the ionic balance, the acid-base balance of the blood, and regulation of the blood pH, and many substances that are not needed. They are either we ingest them, or sometimes they are the products of metabolism in the body. These wastes are excreted by the kidneys in the urine, and moreover the kidney also produce some hormones like erythropoietin, renin, active vitamin D3, and kidney is also involved in gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of glucose from amino acids and non-carbohydrate substances. Now, if we come to the blood supply of the kidney, the renal artery, which is a branch of the aorta, it divides into segmental arteries, and the segmental arteries further divides into the interlobar arteries that runs between the lobes. As I said, that renal lobe consists of the pyramid with the upper lying cortical zone, and the interlobar arteries finally divide to form the arcuate arteries that runs the base of the pyramids, and they divide into the cortical radiate artery branches, and finally the afferent arteriole enters into the glomerulus and divides here into form glomerular tufts of the capillaries, and blood from the glomerulus then enters into the afferent arteriole, and this high pressure area in the glomerulus is mainly, it provides hydrostatic pressure and is responsible for filtration. The afferent arteriole again divides into capillaries known as the peritubular capillaries that surround the tubules for the final fine tuning of the urine. Now we know that each kidney has about more than 1 million nephrons, and this makes a large reserve, so that when 3/4 of the kidney is damaged, still it works and maintains the purpose of the excretion of the body wastes and usually the symptoms of the kidney disease becomes evident when more than 75% of the nephrons are damaged. So this upper region and this capsule which surrounds the glomerulus is known as the Bowman's capsule or Bowman's space. The nephron, which is the functional unit, consists of the renal corpuscle and the tubular system. And in the renal glomerulus, the capillary endothelium of the glomeruli is separated from the visceral epithelial cells which are specialized cells known as podocytes having foot processes by the basement membrane. The basement membrane of the glomerular capillary, known as the glomerular basement membrane or GBM, is very important, and it has foot processes, and these foot processes wrap the basement membrane, and in between the interdigitating foot processes there are small slits known as the filtration slits, and normally through these filtration slits only water, glucose and ionic salts are allowed to filter and to pass into the filtrate, but cells and larger proteins they cannot pass through the filtration slits. Now in this picture we can see the glomerulus, which is the filtration unit of the nephron. The afferent arteriole carries blood into the glomerular capillaries, and this afferent arteriole is comparatively wider than the afferent arterioles, and this produces a high pressure state in the glomerulus. The glomerular capillaries lie in a connective tissue like network known as the mesangium, and which is formed by the mesangial cells, and mesangial cells are active cells, and they have various functional and structural properties that are very important in relation to some diseases of the glomeruli. The glomerular capillaries, unlike other capillaries in the body, they have holes and fenestrations through which the blood plasma filters into the Bowman's capsule. The basement membrane of the glomerular basement membrane of the kidney is very important. On the inner side towards the glomerulus there are endothelial cells with fenestrations, and outside the capillaries there is the very specialized basement membrane, and outside the basement membrane is the visceral epithelium. These visceral epithelial cells, known as the podocytes, they have got foot processes which interdigitate, and the openings in between the interdigitating foot processes of the visceral epithelium form the filtration slits, and the outer portion of the epithelial cell is the parietal epithelium, which lines the inner lining of the Bowman capsule, and this is the space, urinary space, where the filtrate collects and finally drains into the proximal convoluted tubules. Here we take a cut section of the glomerulus, and in this picture we can see that the glomerular capillaries, these are the glomerular capillaries, they lie in the mesangium surrounded by the mesangial cells, and these mesangial cells are specialized cells, contractile cells, and they are phagocytic cells. If any antigen or foreign body enters in this region, these mesangial cells have the capability to ingest the foreign agents, and these mesangial cells form the mesangial matrix. As I said that the capillary endothelium is fenestrated, it has got holes through which filtration occurs under the hydrostatic pressure. The inner lying epithelium is the visceral epithelium, which lies on the outer side with the basement membrane in between the endothelium and the visceral epithelium, and visceral epithelial cells known as the podocytes have their foot processes, and these foot processes interdigitate with each other, and in between the interdigitations there are filtration slits. The outer portion of the epithelium forms the parietal epithelium, which lines the inner lining of the Bowman's capsule. Now, the basement membrane in a glomerulus that lies between the glomerular capillary endothelium and the visceral epithelial layer made of podocytes, this membrane is very important. And there are two barriers in each glomerulus. The first barrier is the endothelial cell fenestrations. Comparatively, this is a wide barrier. It is about 70 to 100 nanometers, and except the cells and larger plasma proteins, all the plasma can be filtrated through these capillary fenestrations, and the initially filtrate is just similar to the plasma with the exception of the larger proteins and cells. Now, this filtrate, after passing through the wide capillary fenestrations, it has to pass through the filtration slits, which are formed by the interdigitating foot processes of the visceral epithelial cells, and this is the actual barrier because it is 20 to 30 nanometer in diameter, and molecules with larger size cannot pass through it. And there are two barriers. One is the charge barrier, because all the structures in this area is negatively charged and they will repel the negatively charged molecules. And the second barrier is the size barrier. So comparatively, the penetration is having a wide size about 70 to 100 nanometer. So the plasma can be easily filtered through the capillary penetrations, but before it passes into the glomerular filtrate, it has to pass through the small size barrier of the filtration slits. Moreover, this area is negatively charged, so negatively charged molecules are repelled, and in some glomerular diseases, for example, the minimal change disease, only the loss of this negative charge causes proteins to pass through the filtration slits and to appear in the urine. So one is the size barrier and the other is the charge barrier. The basement membrane of the glomerular capillaries or glomerulus is very important. If we have a close look over the basement membrane, it consists of a central disc, a central thick and rigid portion known as the lamina densa. The capillary basement membrane or the glomerular basement membrane or GBM is mainly made of the type 4 collagen, and this type 4 collagen is made of the triple helix of the various alpha polypeptide chains, and an understanding of the basement membrane is very important because certain diseases, particularly diseases of the autoimmune origin like the Goodpasture syndrome, they particularly affect this basement membrane. The inner side and the outer side of the basement membrane as compared to its central portion, it is electron lucent. By that we mean that it is not so thick and dense like the central region. So the known as the lamina rara externa and lamina rara interna. The lamina rara interna is that portion of the glomerular basement membrane that lies just outside the capillary endothelium. By that we mean that here in this region lies the glomerular capillaries. While the other electron lucent portion known as the lamina rara externa, it faces and is situated toward the visceral epithelial cells are the podocytes, and the foot processes it overlap the basement membrane with the interdigitating foot processes that contains the filtration slits. Now, as we say that the basement membrane is composed of an outer visceral epithelial layer which contains the podocytes and with its interdigitating foot processes, then the basement membrane with a central thick portion, the lamina densa, and on each side the electron lucent portion, lamina rara externa towards the epithelial side and lamina rara interna towards the endothelial endothelium of the capillaries. And the photocyte foot processes that overlay the basement membrane with the interdigitating foot processes, and where we see the filtration slits. And the filtration slits are lined by the nephrin molecules that unite together with some other molecules and form the slit diaphragms. And in certain conditions and diseases, these slit diaphragms are particularly affected, and there is abnormal filtration of proteins and other substances. Now, another important structure known as the Juxtaglomerular Complex. It is situated between the distal convoluted tubules and the afferent arterioles. The tubules, after passing towards portions of the proximal convoluted tubules, loop up Henle and distal convoluted tubules, and finally in the distal convoluted tubules. So this is the distal convoluted tubule, and this is the afferent arteriole that carries blood to the glomerulus. So in between these two structures, there is the structure of the juxtaglomerular complex. Now, this complex contains in the distal convoluted tubule the macula densa cells. And these macula densa cells signal and communicate the juxtaglomerular cells that are situated in the afferent arteriole. In between the macula densa cells and juxtaglomerular cells, there are cells known as the extraglomerular mesangial cells, which act as a communication between these two structures. So, whenever there is low sodium concentration and low blood flow in the afferent arteriole, which may be caused by low sodium and water, it will stimulate the macula densa cells. And these macula densa cells then, through the extraglomerular mesangial cells that act as a communication, they will stimulate the juxtaglomerular cells in the afferent arterioles. And what happens that The juxtaglomerular cells then secrete the hormone renin, and this renin will convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, and that will be converted in the lungs by the angiotensin converting enzymes into the angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is not only a vasoconstrictor, but it also stimulates the secretion of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. And this exercise will stimulate the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. Aldosterone is secreted by the uh, glomerular layers of the uh, adrenal gland, and aldosterone will increase sodium reabsorption through the proximal convoluted tubules, and this sodium reabsorption will pull water against, and it will increase the blood volume overall. And moreover, the antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary, which responds to the osmolality of the blood, it will also increase the reabsorption of sodium and water from the tubules, and to increase the blood volume and to maintain the blood pressure. Moreover, the angiotensin 2 is also a vasoconstrictor, and it will cause constriction of the blood vessels to maintain the blood pressure. Now, this was just a brief uh, and quick review of the physiological anatomy of the kidney. I hope my students will study them in detail, and then keeping in mind these simple physiological functions and anatomical structures of the kidney, we will proceed to the diseases of the kidneys. And for our convenience, we divide diseases of the kidneys into those diseases of the glomeruli. And keep in mind, my dear students, that diseases affecting the glomeruli are most oftenly immunologically mediated injuries. Then we will discuss the diseases of the tubules and interstitium. And remember that the diseases of the tubules and interstitium are frequently caused by toxic agents and various infections. And finally, we will study the diseases of the blood vessels. So, from our next lecture, we will start glomerular diseases, and the three important glomerular diseases are the nephrotic syndrome, which is just a presentation of the underlying glomerular damage. And if the glomerular damage becomes more severe, nephrotic syndrome will evolve into nephrotic syndrome, in which the red blood cells also come along with protein in the urine. And we will discuss the rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis, which in a short period of time causes severe damage to the kidney and may cause the kidney failure. Thank you.